Module 4 of the Dust Academy. I am Verena Balz, Assistant Professor at the Department of Urbanism, Delft University of Technology, and Principal Investigator of the Dust Project. I'm going to speak about the Regional Futures Literacy Labs, or RFLLs. The RFLLs are a participatory format for positioning the interests of least engaged communities in just sustainability transition policymaking. We have tested the format in 4 European transition regions. In each region, we have involved another community. In Norrbotten, we have worked with a rural community, in Katowice with generations in mining families, in Stare Zagora with a community of citizens, and in Lusatia, we have worked with young people. As you may have already heard from Neely, involving least engaged communities in transition policy making knows many challenges. The most important ones that we addressed with the lab format are listed on this slide. Least engaged communities often lack the willingness and abilities to participate. Transitions create a contentious setting. Many communities who are most affected are anxious and have lost trust in government. Sustainability transition policy making is complex as it involves multiple policies at EU, national, regional, and local levels. And the impact of transitions and transition policies often accumulates at the regional scale, which is difficult to grasp as a meaningful and relevant geography or place for communities. The main objectives of the RFLLs were to enhance citizen knowledge and awareness, build trust, integrate local knowledge, and provide a forum for communities to communicate their hopes, expectations, and concerns. Most importantly, the RFLLs were to facilitate the proactive and strategic positioning of citizens in the deliberative governance of transition policymaking. The format consists of a series of elements addressing the barriers and challenges that I have mentioned before. In my lesson, I will point at these elements and explain why they are important. The main objective of my lesson is to explain the RFLL format as a whole. You will learn that the RFLLs combine instruments in a strategic approach and why this is essential. On this slide, you can see an overview of the RFLL process on one diagram. The 2 colors indicate that the format has 2 main components. The first one is about interaction and includes a series of 4 workshops and 1 additional digital interaction with the public. The second component is in a backstage function where input for and the results from the interactions are prepared and processed. This component is about analysis, reflection, design, and representation. Now I take you by the hand and lead you through a full RFLL process. I will be very brief in my explanations because Lene Isja has an own lesson about the process focused more on the interactive workshops. The first step in the labs was a preparatory one. The interest of communities and local, national, and EU sustainability transition policy measures were mapped and compared. The result was in themes openly framing the first conversations in the labs. During the first workshop, communities and policymakers met to discuss the projected impacts of transitions and transition policy making on communities. At the end of the workshop, communities decided on the scope of the upcoming deliberations themselves. During the second workshop, community members discussed their expected and preferred futures in relation to the sustainability transitions. The workshop used the Futures Literacy Lab format and was a safe space attended by communities only. Step number 4 happened backstage. An analysis of the conversations led in workshop 2 enabled the visualization of the regional futures that communities expect to happen, as well as the futures they would prefer. Also, the 5th step happened backstage, a comparison between these community futures and policy impact projections provided insights into communities' opinions and positions on local, national, and EU policy making. During the third workshop, communities developed these positions into concrete policy statements. In step 7, the policy statements were then submitted for public digital deliberation in each case study region. The e-democracy tool Polis enabled the public to vote on and comment on the statements. The final step of the labs was in the fourth workshop. During this workshop, communities and policymakers translated the outcomes from earlier steps into practical recommendations for policymakers at various levels of government. This was a brief sketch of the RFFL process. I will now highlight individual elements and explain why they are important. I have said that during the first step in the labs, the interests of communities and policy measures were translated into themes openly framing the conversations. Why is such open framing important? Deliberation works well when it is inclusive. Open framing guarantees that deliberation is not determined by predefined policy problems or discourses, but by the interests of communities. Least engaged communities understand transitions through the lens of how these impact their life and place of living. Policies, on the other hand, see transitions through the lens of economic restructuring. Open framing allows for the restructuring of these fragmenting understandings and narratives. I have explained that workshop 2 and 3 were safe spaces attended by communities only. Why are such safe spaces important? Communities build arguments through internal negotiation, specifically when members are diverse and differ, for example, in age, gender, or residence across regions. Communities perceive transitions through the lens of their lives and places, as I have mentioned before. They need time to expand their attention to include a wider account of development into their argumentation. The labs also aimed at building social capital, which is constituted by relations to others. Safe spaces provide a room for bonding and evidently increase connections among community members. Communities and policymakers met for the initial and the last RFFL workshop. Why is such recurring involvement of policymakers important? Communities and policymakers get to know and trust each other. Communities feel that the labs are important because policymakers attend. Communities build argument that relates to policymaking. Their positions become more policy relevant and representative in respect to public discourses. And policymakers can support specifically the positioning of communities' interests and help the dissemination of results. Community members discuss their expected and preferred futures using the so-called Futures Literacy Lab format. Why is futures literacy important? Firstly, it increases communities' understanding of time. It triggers agency around own futures. It encourages innovative ideas, value shifts, and new perspectives on transitions, and in this way help community to position themselves in complex transitional development. Futures literacy also helps to expand the depth of argumentation and deliberative reasoning, and communities bond during futuring exercises. The interests of communities and policy measures were compared during the first and the fifth backstage step in the RFFL process. Why is such comparison important? Reflexive comparison encourages learning and supports the formation of argument. Positioning communities' arguments close to policymaking increases the likelihood of impact and is in this way strategic. Comparison supports focusing deliberation on areas that are not dominated by diverging core beliefs and thus help constructive dialogue. I want to give you an impression of how we accomplished comparison. Here you see a cluster diagram identifying relations between aspects of transitional development. This diagram depicts narratives and arguments behind communities' preferred futures. In this diagram, you see in blue the aspects that also matter in policy. Here, the positions of communities were strategically located. I have said that the futures analysis enabled the visualization of regional futures. Here you see one of these designs. Artists, whose architects, led the making of these designs. They chose for juxtaposing the different community and policy futures in the form of triptychs. Why are such regional designs important? Firstly, they encourage storytelling. Effective communication allows for an emotional reading of transitional development, and representing communities' interests in effective and attractive ways helps to transport positions into the public realm. We submitted community statements for that public digital deliberation using the e-democracy tool Polis. Why is such deliberation with the public important? Participatory formats enhance deliberation, but results are often not representative. This step strives for representativeness and, in this way, legitimacy of the results from the labs. The RFFLs were designed to facilitate the proactive and strategic positioning of citizens in the deliberative governance of transition policymaking. The position papers that were the results of the 4 RFFLs in the 4 case study regions provide evidence that we achieved these goals. Check them out. There's evidence that the labs also increased least engaged communities' trust in government and governance, enhanced their agency and social capital, and expanded their understanding of transitional and regional development and policy making. On the side of policymakers, knowledge about communities increased, as well as the perceived importance of involving them in policy making. In the beginning of my lesson, I have said that the RFFL format is not a tool, but a strategy. Why is this so? The format has supported a flow of argumentation from openly framed themes to precise positions. This was enabled by combining distinct elements for their best performance. Combinations have emphasized interaction versus analysis, design, representation, and reflection, community versus policy interests, internal safe versus external and more public communication, analog versus digital instruments, participatory versus representative functions, cognitive versus affective ways of knowing and reasoning, and interpersonal versus analytical versus artistic, and many more other talents. It is important to note that there is not one RFFL format that fits all situations. Instead, the format needs to be custom-tailored to situations in specific regions and communities. After having listened to my brief lesson, you may already want to reflect how elements of the lab can become most meaningful for your region or community. Finally, I have a small quiz question for you. Why is it important to frame deliberation openly? Thank you for having listened to Module 4 of the DAST Academy.